The year was 1998. The world had already seen the face of human pain and beauty through the lens of Sebastião Salgado. He was a master of light and shadow, a visual chronicler of migration, misery, and the indomitable strength of the human spirit. He had just returned from an epic and exhausting journey for the Exodus Project, a visceral immersion into the global diaspora that had taken him to the ends of the earth, exposing him to the harshness of survival. The weight of these images, the sum total of all the suffering he had witnessed, had taken a heavy toll. He was exhausted, his soul raw. It was time to return to Bulco Farm, the land where he was born and forged his first dreams, in the interior of Minas Gerais. Salgado sought refuge, a balm for the invisible wounds of his mind. But what he found was not the nostalgic paradise of his childhood, but rather a landscape of desolation that matched, in its very stillness, the refugee camps he had just photographed. Bulco Farm, once a vibrant green carpet, a pulsating ecosystem that fed the Rio Doce, was unrecognizable. What Salgado remembered as dense, humid forest was now an arid, grayish-brown landscape, dotted with dry stumps. The once grand rainforest had been decimated by the ravages of time, cattle ranching, and uncontrolled extractivism. Worse still, of the countless springs that irrigated the property, nearly all had gone silent. Life had drained from the land. The shock was overwhelming. Salgado, who had seen the worst of humanity, now confronted the pain of still life in his own home. His depression deepened. He felt like a failed spectator, incapable of saving the land that had raised him. The photographer, accustomed to documenting the end of worlds, was witnessing the end of his own world. It was then that Lelia Wanik Salgado, his wife, partner in life and in all their projects, intervened with a vision that transcended the camera lens. She looked at the devastated landscape and saw not death, but dormant potential. It was Lelia who lit the spark. "We can't just accept this, Sebastião. This land doesn't need an obituary, it needs a new birth. We will replant the forest." The idea, in that death-defying landscape, seemed quixotic madness. A farm almost entirely destroyed, with less than 0.5% of its original forest area, dependent on rain for survival. But Lelia's calm, determined voice planted a seed of hope in Sebastião's exhausted soul. The Exodus Project was over. The Genesis Project, the creation of a new Eden, was about to begin. No longer with a camera, but with bare hands in the soil. The couple was about to trade flashes and film for hoes and seedlings. But how could a couple of artists with no forestry experience and limited resources reverse decades of destruction? And more crucially, how could they convince nature itself to return to a place it had already abandoned? Lelia's proposal, replanting the forest, was less an idea and more a rallying cry against despair. Sebastião, the man who had documented tragedies on a global scale, recognized the irony. Now, his personal and local tragedy would require a different kind of heroism, one the camera couldn't capture. The first step was the hardest, transforming pain into planning. Lelia and Sebastião quickly realized they couldn't do it alone. The farm didn't need a garden. It needed an entire ecosystem. They sought out experts, agronomists, biologists, and foresters, but the initial response was discouraging. The consensus was nearly unanimous. The land was exhausted, the soil compacted and eroded, lacking the fertile layer that sustains the life of the Atlantic forest. Many told them it would be a waste of time and money. Nature, they warned, is unforgiving. It was during this period of skepticism that the project took its first fundamental turn. Lelia Wanik, with her experience in design and exhibition curation, applied the same meticulous, long-term vision to the land. She saw the project as a gigantic blank canvas, an organic work of art. The key was not just planting trees, but recreating the complexity of the original forest. The goal wasn't simply to achieve a planting rate. The couple came across an alarming scientific fact. For the forest to have a real chance of regenerating and sustaining itself, a staggering level of genetic diversity was required. The Atlantic forest is one of the richest and most threatened biomes in the world, with thousands of species. They couldn't use just a few easy-to-find varieties. They needed hundreds of native tree species, reproducing the lost richness. The scale of the mission began to take shape. The area to be restored was 608 hectares, the equivalent of more than 850 football fields. The number of seedlings needed rose to millions, and each of these seedlings needed to be the right species, planted in the right place, respecting the complex ecological succession that takes years to establish. The couple then made the decision that would seal the project's fate and give rise to Instituto Terra. Instead of simply planting, they would create their own nursery. This would be no ordinary nursery. It would be a botanical Noah's Ark, dedicated exclusively to native species, many of them endangered. They would need to collect rare and difficult-to-reach seeds, some found only in remote, hard-to-reach reserves. This meant that Sebastião, the photographer who had crossed continents, would have to travel through the remaining forests of Minas Gerais, hunting not for images, but for seeds. While setting up their first makeshift nursery, the initial team faced their first major challenge: a lack of water. They needed water to irrigate the first seedlings, but the farm's springs remained dry. It would be a vicious cycle. The forest needed water, but the water would only return if there was forest. They were planting in arid soil, taking a leap of faith in natural engineering. The project seemed doomed to failure even before the first seed germinated. What would be the strategy to break this cycle of aridity and coax the 2,000 springs which seemed forever dead back to life? Lelia's vision of a new Eden and Sebastião's determination to reclaim his roots gave legal and operational form to the dream. In 1998, Instituto Terra was born, but they knew that planting millions of trees wouldn't be enough. They needed to restore the forest's very function. The first major technical hurdle was methodology. Many experts recommended planting eucalyptus or other fast-growing species to fix the soil, a common practice, but one that would result in a monoculture, a simulacrum of forest. The couple vehemently refused. Their goal was the authentic regeneration of the Atlantic forest. It was then that they adopted the method of forest restoration with native species and enrichment, a bold technique that required monumental patience. It wasn't enough to simply mix seeds. They needed to understand the forest's hierarchy. They needed to plant the pioneer species, the fast-growing ones that prepare the soil, followed by the secondary species, which provide shade and moisture, and finally the climax species, the slow-growing, hardwood species that ensure the forest's maturity for centuries. It was like composing a botanical symphony. The logistics were overwhelming. The nursery, initially rudimentary, became a precision operation. Teams were formed to travel through fragments of remaining native forest throughout the Rio Doce Basin, a vast region, collecting seeds in the wild. It was a silent hunt for genetic diversity, an invisible treasure. There was an even more secret challenge. Many Atlantic forest seeds have a long, difficult-to-break dormancy period. Some take months, even years, to germinate under natural conditions. The Terra Institute had to develop techniques for scarification, damaging the shell to allow water to penetrate, and stratification, simulating cold winter conditions, in the laboratory, speeding up geological time. In the first 3 years, the fight against seedling mortality was brutal. Poor soil, pests, and above all the lack of water during dry periods claimed thousands of plant lives. It seemed the earth was rejecting the effort, as if saying, "It's too late." The turning point came with the realization that the key to life lay in organic matter. They needed to create soil that would act like a sponge, capable of retaining the little moisture that fell. They began incorporating tons of straw, pruning waste, and organic fertilizer, transforming the depleted sand into a thin but vital layer of humus. The local community, initially skeptical, began to observe the relentless work. Many laughed at the rich man's project that attempted to plant trees where cattle could no longer graze. But what they didn't know was that the Institute's strategy went beyond trees. It targeted the subsoil. If organic matter and roots returned, they would form an underground network of microchannels. This network, according to Lelia's theory, would be the key to the central intrigue, the return of the 2,000 springs. They hadn't disappeared, merely hidden. The water couldn't penetrate the compacted and eroded soil. It ran superficially, causing floods and quickly drying up. The Institute was, in effect, planting a gigantic and very slow-flowing water sponge. But the weight was excruciating. The first hundreds of thousands of seedlings seemed tiny and vulnerable in the vastness of the farm. Would faith and science be enough to reverse decades of devastation and convince the first springs, after years of silence, to flow again? The Instituto Terra couldn't just be an ecological restoration project. It needed to be a center for cultural change. The initial skepticism of the region's residents, many of whom were cattle ranchers or farmers accustomed to deforestation, was as great an obstacle as the arid soil. How could they convince an entire community that the forest, long seen as an impediment to progress, was actually their greatest asset? Lelia and Sebastião understood that the story's moral needed to be shared. They created environmental education programs, bringing students, farmers, and local politicians into the nursery. The goal was to show that the project wasn't about protecting nature from humans, but rather about coexisting with it sustainably. The team, initially made up of residents with no forestry experience, became the beating heart of the project. They were trained to be guardians of biodiversity, learning to identify hundreds of seed species, the complexities of germination, and precise planting techniques. This transformation of neighbors into experts was the Institute's first major social victory. As the community was conquered, planting progressed. Each year, hundreds of thousands of seedlings were transported from the nursery to the clearings. The work was exhausting, manual, and during long dry periods, painful. The couple's big bet, water regeneration through organic matter and tree root systems, was slow to bear fruit. Years passed with the springs still eerily silent. The pressure was immense, funding was scarce, and maintaining faith in nature's slow process, when the visible results were only small, fragile seedlings, required an almost irrational tenacity. The first sign that the water sponge was working came from a subtle but deeply moving observation. Around the 5th year of intensive planting, after a long rainy season, one of the Institute's workers, a man who grew up in the region and witnessed the dying of the waters, rushed to warn the team. In an area of the farm where reforestation had thickened, and the trees were already reaching adult height, he noticed a persistent puddle. It wasn't a simple accumulation of rain. It was the mud characteristic of saturated soil. Then came the true miracle: sound. A faint murmur began to be heard in one of the protected areas. At the site of one of the farm's most important springs, which had been dry for more than 2 decades, a trickle of water began to emerge, the first trickle of pure water in years. Tree roots had penetrated the compacted soil, creating channels that allowed rainwater to infiltrate and replenish the water table. The newly planted forest was literally drawing the water back into the earth. That trickle of water wasn't just H2O. It was physical proof that Lelia was right. Nature was responding. The intrigue now became a race against time. If a trickle had returned, how quickly and at what scale would the hundreds of other dry springs respond? And how could this small stream of life be protected so that it would become a river of hope? With the first trickle of water reappearing, Instituto Terra's faith turned into conviction. That small stream was the promise that the effort was not in vain. The restoration process, slow and methodical, began to accelerate. The trees planted in the first stage, now more mature, created the necessary shade and moisture, protecting the younger seedlings from the scorching sun and erosion. The forest was beginning to heal. The great faunal intrigue began to unfold. The devastated landscape could not sustain animals. The absence of life was almost as painful as the absence of trees. But with the return of water and the increasing density of vegetation, the ecosystem's messengers began to return. First came the insects and small birds, attracted by the flowers and fruits of the pioneers. Next came the amphibians, frogs and toads, whose nocturnal calls were the most eloquent sound of the returning water. What deeply moved Sebastião and Lelia was the return of bird species they hadn't seen since childhood, such as the guan and the green-billed toucan. These animals weren't just returning, they were here to stay, acting as veritable forest engineers. Animals fulfilled a crucial and mysterious role that humans could not replace: seed dispersal. By eating fruits and depositing their feces, They seeded species in remote areas of the farm, ensuring that regeneration was more natural and diverse than any manual planting. The forest was finally beginning to spread on its own, using wind, water, and animal life as its primary agents. The project went from being just a restored farm to a living laboratory. Scientists and researchers from Brazil and around the world began visiting the Instituto Terra, fascinated by the boldness of the plan and the results. The moral of the story grew. The Institute was proving that massive destruction can be reversed, and that the key lies not just in planting, but in understanding the complexity of biodiversity. The planting methodology, the creation of a nursery for exclusively native species, and the focus on restoring aquatic ecosystems became an international model for forest restoration. They were scientifically proving that deforestation was not a permanent death sentence for the planet. By this point, Instituto Terra had already planted millions of seedlings. The density and height of the new forest created a noticeable microclimate. The air was more humid, the temperature milder. The difference between the before, dry pasture, and the after, growing forest was stark, but the work was far from over. The most difficult task was yet to come, maintaining the mature forest. It took 20 years or more for the climax species, the giant trees that define the Atlantic forest, to begin to dominate. Moreover, the success at Fazenda Bolcão created a new and dangerous intrigue: how to ensure that the efforts of a single farm would not merely be a temporary oasis, but rather the catalyst for the recovery of the entire Rio Doce Basin, one of the most degraded regions in the country. With each passing year, the difference became more evident. What began as a desperate effort had transformed into a functioning biome. The land Sebastião had revisited in 1998, arid and silent, now echoed with the sounds of a young, vibrant forest. The most dramatic evidence of this rebirth, however, was hidden beneath the earth. The water sponge strategy, planting diverse, deep-rooted crops and recreating organic soil, was paying dividends. With each new rainy season, water penetrated the soil more efficiently, instead of running off and causing erosion. The water table, which had seemed exhausted, began to slowly refill, like a sealed underground reservoir suddenly finding its flow channels again. The mystery of the 2,000 springs, a vital number for the health of the Rio Doce Basin, was about to be resolved. The springs, which had fallen silent due to deforestation that compacted the soil and exposed the source to the sun, were being reactivated. Not explosively, but gradually and persistently. The murmur of a trickle multiplied, transforming into small, permanent streams. The Terra Institute began systematically monitoring each water point. The results were unmistakable. Where there had been drought and erosion, water flowed again. Scientific measurements confirmed it. Reforestation in strategic areas of Bolcão Farm was regenerating the hydrological cycle. The moral of Lelia and Sebastião's story came true. The forest doesn't need water to grow. The forest creates the water. The news spread beyond Brazil's borders. The photographer of tragedies and exoduses was now the protagonist of a genesis. He had proven that the despair of the past could be transformed into tangible hope for the future. The success in Bolcão was a beacon, showing that restoring riparian forests, the vegetation surrounding rivers, was the most effective strategy to combat the water crisis. However, success brought with it a new and grave responsibility. Bolcão Farm was just a small portion of the immense Rio Doce Basin, which continued to suffer from deforestation and years later would face one of the country's greatest environmental catastrophes, the collapse of the Fundo Dam in Mariana in 2015. The couple realized that their mission was not just to plant trees, but to export their knowledge and conviction. They had created a model that needed to be replicated at scale. The new puzzle was how to convince hundreds of neighboring farmers, with their own cultures and economic interests, to adopt a long-term vision and start their own regeneration movement, transforming an isolated oasis into an interconnected regional forest. The challenge moved from planting to politics and persuasion. With Bolcão Farm transformed into a private natural heritage reserve, RPPN, and the 2,000 springs proving that regeneration was possible, Instituto Terra turned to the most complex challenge: mass persuasion. The Rio Doce Basin is made up of hundreds of municipalities and thousands of private properties. Sebastio and Lelia's oasis would not survive in the long term if it were surrounded by degradation. They knew that converting their neighbors wouldn't come through sermons, but through practical, economic demonstrations. The Institute began producing and distributing free seedlings and offering technical assistance to local farmers. The message was simple: restoring riparian forests isn't just a legal obligation. It's an investment in the water that irrigates their land and sustains their livestock. The intrigue of this phase was how to use Sebastião Salgado's global fame to leverage a local project. Sebastião, the photographer, traded the recording of pain for the recording of hope. His exhibitions around the world, which previously showcased the austere beauty of the Genesis Project, not the Instituto Terra project, but the photo book about untouched landscapes, now included the living history of Fazenda Bulcão. He used his platform to attract attention and resources, transforming each click into a planted seedling. Lelia, in turn, focused on structural change. She knew that large-scale replication required more than goodwill. It required public policies. The Terra Institute worked intensively to raise awareness of the importance of environmental legislation, pushing for oversight and reforestation incentive programs. The project's success became definitive proof that the Native Vegetation Protection Law, Forest Code, was feasible and beneficial. During this period, the Institute consolidated its research area, monitoring the return of endangered species, both flora and fauna, to the new forest. The return of the muriqui, one of the largest primates in the Americas and a symbol of the Atlantic forest, would be a scientific milestone that would cement the importance of Bulcão Farm as a vital ecological corridor. However, the project faced a silent and constant threat: fire. Prolonged droughts and neighboring pasture fires posed a real danger of destroying years of effort in a matter of hours. The Institute had to develop a rigorous system of fire breaks, strips of cleared soil that prevent the spread of fire, and surveillance. The biggest challenge remained scale. How to make the moral of the story, nature's ability to regenerate through human action, inspire millions of similar actions, not just one. The answer lay in transforming the story of Fazenda Bulcão into a curriculum for restoration. What began as a healing for a photographer's exhausted soul and his wife's determined vision has become a living monument to the power of regeneration. More than 2 decades after its first planting, Fazenda Bulcão was no longer just a farm. It was the Instituto Terra, a mature ecosystem protected by law and respected by science. The numbers, once considered unattainable, became a silent testament to success. The Institute had planted more than 2.7 million seedlings of over 300 native Atlantic forest species in a 608-hectare restoration project. The forest, which had less than 0.5% of its original cover, had been rebuilt from scratch. But the most exciting figure was water. The promise of 2,000 springs saved was being fulfilled. The denser vegetation and increased soil porosity revived the water table, ensuring the steady flow of countless streams that fed the Rio Doce. Bulcão Farm was once again exporting clean water to the region. Where there was drought, there was water. Where there was erosion, there was life. This transformation had a direct impact on biodiversity. Monitoring revealed that the new forest was becoming home to hundreds of species that had previously disappeared. Bird species, some endangered, species of mammals, species of amphibians and reptiles. The forest was the driving force, but Instituto Terra was the disseminator. It had trained thousands of people in restoration and seedling production techniques. The model wasn't static. It adapted to the needs of other properties in the Rio Doce Basin, promoting planting in permanent preservation areas, PPAs, and neighboring springs. The story's great moral, which transcends the beauty of the trees, is the lesson of time. Lelia and Sebastião proved that to heal a damaged planet, one must accept nature's rhythm. Success didn't come in a year or even 5, but required decades of uninterrupted dedication, facing plagues, droughts, and skepticism. The story of Fazenda Bulcão has become a narrative of hope for the world, inspiring reforestation projects on other continents. Sebastião Salgado, the photographer who saw hell in Exodus, found his paradise in Genesis, not in the virgin forests, but in the one he helped recreate in his homeland. However, the legacy carries a warning. The young forest, though robust, requires continuous maintenance and constant vigilance against fire and illegal deforestation. The challenge for the future lies in the project's sustainability. How can we ensure the perpetuity of this forest and this model, transforming it into an irreversible public policy that protects the entire Rio Doce Basin from environmental threats and neglect? The success of Instituto Terra transcended environmental metrics. The true moral of the story lies in the profound transformation the project wrought in its founders and all those who visited it. Sebastião Salgado, the man who nearly succumbed to the pain of the world he documented, found his own healing in the land. The growing forest, with its silent beauty and slow pace, was the antidote to the trauma of Exodus. He realized that the destruction of the forest wasn't just an ecological act. It was a reflection of human disconnection from its environment. By replanting the trees, he wasn't just restoring the ecosystem. He was re-establishing the ancestral relationship between man and nature. Bulcão Farm became, metaphorically, the soil where the photographer's hope and mental health once again germinated. The final intrigue was philosophical in nature. What did Bulcão's story teach us about our ability to reverse disaster? The Salgado's answer was clear. Nature is resilient, but it needs a starting point. Regeneration is not passive. It requires intense initial action, informed by science and driven by passion. They proved that degradation, even after decades, is not the final destination. Instituto Terra has become a global symbol that the climate and ecological crisis should not lead to fatalism, but rather to immediate and strategic action. The project also revealed a secret about water, vital to the story's moral. A community's quality of life is directly linked to the health of its forests. The 2000 springs saved didn't just irrigate Fazenda Bulcão, they ensured water security and the quality of life of thousands of people in the region. They demonstrated that environmentalism is not a separate cause. It is the foundation of the economy and public health. The Institute's teachings were taken to international forums such as UNESCO and the United Nations, becoming a case study in how individual will, combined with long-term vision, can influence global environmental policy. Sebastião and Lelia demonstrated that the greatest art is not just documenting the world, but actively recreating it. The great challenge, however, remains for future generations. How to ensure that the initial enthusiasm and dedication don't fade over time. The forest, now stronger, will enter a period of maturation. It will need guardians who understand the need to protect it from new threats, such as predatory mining, the advance of the agricultural frontier, and the increasingly severe effects of climate change. Will the story of Sebastião and Lelia be powerful enough to inspire a new legion of forest planters around the world? The story of Fazenda Bulcão is, in essence, the moral that care is the most profound form of art. Sebastião Salgado, who dedicated his life to capturing the light and shadow of the world, found in the earth the canvas for his most enduring masterpiece, a functioning forest, restored to its wild splendor. Lelia Wanek Salgado, with her architectural and design vision, designed not just a nursery, but a model of sustainability that would span generations. Instituto Terra is living proof that ecological restoration is a journey of faith, science, and persistence. It began as a personal utopia and has transformed into a powerful environmental impact machine, generating more than 2.7 million trees and, crucially, reactivating 2,000 springs. This number, more than any other, is the signature of victory. Water, the primary source of all life, has gushed forth once again where there was silence. The Institute's legacy is that it not only planted a forest, but also planted an idea that humans, the agents of destruction, can also be the agents of regeneration. The lesson is that nature, when given the minimum conditions, has an incredible capacity to heal itself. The project taught farmers that the forest is their economic ally, guaranteeing water for production, and taught science that large-scale restoration, focusing on native biodiversity, is the most effective way to combat the water and climate crises. The Salgado's genesis in Minas Gerais has become a replicable model, a curriculum of hope that inspires communities, governments, and NGOs worldwide. The challenge of the project's sustainability is the challenge of all humanity, to view the Earth not as a resource to be exploited, but as a partner to be nurtured. Sebastião and Lelia's story doesn't end in 2024, nor with the last sapling planted. It continues in the murmur of the waters of the reactivated springs, in the song of the returning birds, and in the cool shade of the new forest. The ultimate moral is a call to responsibility. Each of us has a fazenda bulcão to restore, be it a small plot of land, a community, or a mindset. The final intrigue that remains is an invitation to reflect, if a photographer and an architect, with dedication and more than 2 decades of work, managed to reverse a desert and save 2,000 springs in a small part of the planet. What could the combined action of millions of people do for the rest of the world? What is your own seed of hope that needs to be planted?